I've been working in React for over 10 years. I saw React, and at the time, I was working in Angular and I was working in Knockout. Angular 1 was the time, and it was a rather difficult decision at that time. Do you go consider Angular 2 or do you go to React? And I chose React, and that fork in the road meant everything to me. It ultimately led to me quitting my job as a principal engineer and going all in as a consultant. So I've been out as a consultant focused nearly solely on React for a lot of years now. It's been about 10 years since I would have called myself a generalist. So I've been a specialist on the front end, and particularly in React for all this time. So I've watched things change over the years. And the theme of this talk is simple. If I were to sum it up, this is the slide. That this has been true throughout history, that the future's here, but it's not evenly distributed. And I think this quote applies strongly to where we are right now in React, because we just saw this in this room. I asked a moment ago, who in here is using React 19? Given 19 is a release candidate. So if you're using it, then, well, you're kind of a rebel, saying YOLO. I don't know, maybe you're experimenting on your own, but that is the future, and some people are already living in that future. They're experiencing things the rest of us aren't. And this is a fascinating idea to me. And this applies all over the place in the world. Like, you can go to places in the world that are still struggling with the basics. And it's really easy for us to take that for granted here in the United States, but it's not a given that you have all these luxuries that we have. Some of us basically are living in the future according to other humans, because the future doesn't distribute evenly. And this happens in software all the time too. So this is the way that I would summarize where we are in React and why 19 exists at all. That for the last many years, what the React team does is they watch what we're doing. They pay attention to it, and then over time, they see these paths form. And when we see these paths form, we go, you know, it might be nice if we made that simpler. So you think about things that we've added in the past where we got hooks that simplified the way that we create components, got rid of lifecycle methods. We ended up creating things like useReducer to be able to have this simple way to declare state on its own. We said, okay, what if we had a good way to handle global state, global context, injecting dependencies? We got context and these sorts of things. So there's already been this sort of setup before where we sit back, and the reason that React is still so dang popular after all these years has everything to do with the fact that we keep paving these paths. And when I say we, I really mean the React development team itself, the support team. And with this story then, 19 turns that up to a level that I think is unprecedented for React. And to give you sort of a sense of this, I've been thinking about how things have changed just in one little area for me over the years. And I talked about this a little bit in my workshop yesterday. So yesterday I presented a workshop on Advanced React, and I've started doing this Advanced React workshop just around other places. And it's been a lot of fun for me because it's surprising to me how many developers aren't leveraging pieces of React or patterns in React that have been around a long time. Like it really is useful to step back and say, here's patterns we use. And in particular, as somebody who works with a lot of different companies, what I find is there's a surprising amount of variety in the ways that people can work with React in particular, because it's so unopinionated. So people come in and they start doing things. Like just yesterday, I was talking with one developer who was saying, on my team, we are required to use Memo for everything. We just wrap everything and use Memo. And I go, really? Everything? He's like, yeah, just in case. And I go, I wouldn't do that. And he said, yeah, neither would I, but I tried pushing back and I lost, so now I have to do it. And he said, what should I do? And I said, well, I mean, you got to pick your battles. That's probably not one worth losing all your political capital over, and it's probably not something worth quitting over. But if somebody, for instance, said, sorry, we're not going to touch TypeScript, you have to use JavaScript, yeah, I'd probably quit over that. Like, there's a line there. Like, I really do like having types these days. Okay, so I'm off on a tangent a little here, but let's talk about fetching in React. So way back in 2014, I was fetching and component did mount. And I also find this fascinating. How many people have ever fetched and component did mount? Like you look around this room of React developers and it's less than half the room that have done that. Like there's a fair number of people in here that are lucky enough not to have had to mess with class components and this bindings and oh crud, that this context wasn't what I expected and all the foot guns that occurred back in that era. You've got a different set of foot guns now because you get to use UseEffect instead. Trade-offs. So this was 2014, and then in 2019 we got hooks. So I began fetching in UseEffect, and what's interesting is 2019 right here. There are still lots of developers, probably quite a few in here, that are fetching in UseEffect. How many are doing this? This is a very common pattern still to this day. See tons of hands. That's probably over half the room here. And while this works, 2019 is when I would have suggested it, and I wouldn't since then. And the reason I wouldn't do that anymore is 2020, I started creating my own custom hooks. Lots of people started doing this sort of thing, and this is what it looks like. I actually have a course out on Pluralsight called Managing React State, and the thing that I talk about in there is how to create your own custom fetch hook. Now, the reason that I did that had nothing to do with me trying to encourage people to say, hey, you should create your own custom fetch hook. It had everything to do with showing how this is made and why it might be useful. So this is an example of why a custom fetch hook might be desirable. When we started fetching in UseEffect, we ended up with all this code, and I want to just draw attention to some of what you see here because this is going to create a really nice contrast when we look at React Server components in a moment and how much all this stuff just boils down to its essence. So I had to declare state to hold the response from the fetch. I needed state to hold whether it's loading and state to hold whether there's an error because a lot of people don't know this. Error boundaries do not catch any error that occurs within an asynchronous function. And I do this all the time in workshops. People are surprised at that piece of information. So there's a whole set of errors that you might not be catching in your React app right now if you didn't know about that. So you actually have to have state for this so that you can throw the error outside of your async function and therefore have it bubble up to your nearest error boundary. It's an easy thing to overlook. So I'd suggest auditing your code if you haven't checked this recently. But so in here in the UseEffect, I happen to be using promises. Of course, I could use async await, but you get different problems at that point because remember, the function you pass to UseEffect has to be synchronous, at which point now you have to declare that function, invoke it inside of here, so that would add even a little bit more code here. But nonetheless, notice some of the foot guns in here. For one thing, I have to remember the dependency array. I have to remember to call finally here, so whether it fails or succeeds, I set loading properly. I also need to remember to catch errors and then set them into state, which actually I should have done right here. I just realized I've got a logic error. I should call set error right here, and I console errored it instead. Nonetheless, then down here, I actually throw the error in the JSX, so it'll bubble up. So lots of work here, and just imagine, there are plenty of times where you're not doing one fetch call in a component, you might be doing 2 or 3 or 4, and look at how much boilerplate you end up with. Now, what if instead you created a custom hook that allowed you to make each fetch a one-liner? And it looks like this. And I don't know why I find this so satisfying. It's just a really nice animation. Before I go to bed, sometimes I watch this. It just gives me peace. So this is what we build in the course. And again, it's not about using this in production. I show how to build it just to show that it's not particularly complicated. I mainly take that code and then I genericize it a little bit, put it in a hook. You could imagine how this works. But now, what if I had 2 or 3 or 4 different fetch calls? Easy peasy. I just have one line per fetch call. And I destructure what I get back, name what I want. I also can't mess it up because now all that logic is over there in a separate hook. So this is really nice. And that's the way I was getting things done at that time back in 2020. Now, you fast forward just 1 year later, React Query shows up. And this is precisely why I say you don't want to go use that custom hook, because React Query said, what if we create a custom hook and then we contain all that logic and we put a bunch of other good stuff in there, like caching, like retry when your network happens to be flaky, check again anytime that your network actually comes back online, throw errors for you, all sorts of nice goodness that you get with React Query. And I am a huge fan of it. I tend to use React Query on just about any project because having all those features is wonderful and the developer experience is great. So then in 22, I started using use error boundary, and these days the settings actually changed a bit, but nonetheless, now the setting is throw on error. This setting's really useful because you can tell React Query anytime an error occurs, it should throw, which means you don't have to worry about error handling ad hoc in each call site. You don't have to throw an error in your JSX. It's just if your async call fails, it will throw an error on your behalf and it will bubble to an error boundary. So I'm a big fan of this feature. It ends up really leaning out your code. Then in 23, I started doing something rather, this is a little riskier. This is a little controversial, but I was using use suspense query. Now, people in here have probably been using suspense for a long time for lazy loading pages. But I was using suspense also for data fetching starting in 23, even though this is technically not stable. Now, as of React 19, suspense for data fetching will be stable. But that presumes that you're working in a React 19 environment, and I was not. So that's part of why this is rather risky. But I've found it quite enjoyable to use suspense for handling my loading state. So fast forward one more. In 24, this is my favorite way to fetch data if I can do it. It really is nice to work in React Server components. And I show this because in this room, we just established we've got probably, 5% of the room that is living in 2024 in this case. The future's here, it's just not evenly distributed. And part of that reason is because, well, it's a release candidate. I wouldn't expect a bunch of people to be using a release candidate. But I have this little app over here. This app is running React 19. This happens to be using Next.js, although we're also in a very interesting place right now. So just last night I was having a conversation about Next.js versus TAN-Stack Start versus React Router 7 versus Remix. We have all these interesting ways to create React apps today. And I think for a lot of people there's a perception that if you're going to be using React Server components, you basically have to use Next.js. That's not actually true. There are other options almost here, and there's other options that already exist too. But what we're going to have here very soon is something super exciting that if you like the idea of React Server components, you're going to have the ability to use them with React Router 7. You'll probably have the opportunity to use them with TAN-Stack Start here soon. And then, of course, Next.js already supports them. So we're going to have a number of interesting options. And I'm excited to have that optionality out here. So I have this app. This is running Next.js, and it's using the latest version of React 19, the RC. And what I have over here is a few different things. We've got a to-dos app that loads up to-dos. I have a little just simulated blog that shows a blog and loads in some comments. I have a page that merely shows a date. I'll explain why. And then I have a page with contact forms. So I deliberately just created some different things just so I can show some true examples of working with React 19. Now, the demos themselves aren't particularly interesting, but the contrast in the way the code's created, I think, is. So for starters, let's just look at to-dos right here. Notice that when I load to-dos, I get a spinner for a second, and then I see my to-dos. So if I come over here, I have a to-dos folder, and we have a page right here. And this is the beginning of some interesting pieces here. I'm going to put this in Zen mode. All right, how's the font size for the back row? Do we need to go? We're good? Thumbs up. Wonderful. All right, and yes, I use light mode. Please don't judge me. I have an astigmatism. It makes it easier for me to see the text. So with this, notice a few things here. For starters, React 19 is going to encourage you to decompose your components in a way that I find attractive, generally, although at first it felt a little bit odd to me. So notice what's going on here. On the home page, I've got my title. Line 9 is the first thing that might catch your eye. Notice that I'm putting in a title here. This is setting the page title. Now, some of you in here before have probably been using things like Helmet from the NFL. It's a library that lets you set things in the head. Well, you don't need that library anymore because as of React 19, you can just render anything like a title component or other meta tags, and they just magically end up in the head. So React puts this in. So you'll notice that if I come over here and I look at my tab, notice that it says to-dos right here. It is named to-dos. And if I change this to to-dos high and hit save, and I come back over here, now it says to-dos high. So that is just working. The other thing is, this is a server-side rendered piece of markup because it's a React server component. And if I come in here and I search for to-dos high, well, there it is. Now, given this is all on one line because that's just how it is spit out, but you'll notice that that's just plain old HTML that got sent down. That was rendered on the server because we're in React Server Components land. So this is a nice touch. The other thing to notice is, for handling my loading state, I'm not declaring any state. I'm using suspense for data fetching here. So you'll notice I declare suspense and I put a spinner right there. And I say, as long as this fetch to-dos is running, I want to go ahead and put in a spinner. Oh, very important piece of business. Got to get a selfie, y'all, or it didn't happen. That's how it works. So I'm weird. Can we all put our hands up like we're at the amusement park? It just makes it more fun. Here we go. Oh, y'all look great. Very nice. Thank you. Yeah, all right. Now I got to get an Instagram account, one thing at a time. All right. So fetch to-dos. So what's happening is, remember, suspense says anytime this thing down here is suspended, it's going to show this fallback UI instead. So I've created this component called fetch to-dos. And all that fetch to-dos does is it calls fetch, it parses the response, and then returns a component, returns the list of to-dos. Now there's a couple interesting things I want to point out here. One is this right here. Notice that I'm calling to-do schema. This has nothing to do with React 19, but it is very important. How many of you are using Zod? Okay, if you're not using Zod, this may be the most useful thing for you because you don't have to be on React 19, but you should almost certainly be considering it. If you're using TypeScript, even if you're not using TypeScript, Zod is wonderful. Zod runs checks at runtime rather than compile time. Remember, TypeScript only exists at compile time. It doesn't exist in the browser. Zod is a runtime type checker. So with Zod, I can make sure that the JSON I'm getting back from this endpoint is what I expect. It should have these properties, it should be a number, it should be a string, it should be this object with these fields, that sort of thing. So Zod is really useful. A good way to think about it too, Zod is more powerful than TypeScript, and a good way to remember why is, ask yourself, which sounds more powerful, TypeScript or Zod? See? There you go. I was practicing that beforehand. It worked. Okay. So we have this fetch to-dos here. Now, the way that suspense works is, notice line 20. I just come in here and I'm waiting on a promise. As long as this promise is not resolved, it's going to keep showing the suspense fallback right here. Once we get down here to 22 and this returns some real JSX instead of an unresolved promise, once this resolves right here, then the suspense fallback goes away and this to-dos renders instead. That's the idea. So you'll notice though, I just fetched data, had a loading state, and how much state did I declare? 0. The future of React is almost here, and in that future of React, you could have a situation where you rarely call use state. And I think that's fantastic, because before I was doing it all the time. You also have a future where you are going to rarely touch use effect. Can I get a hallelujah? Yeah. That is maybe the most exciting part, because I don't know about you all, but use effect is such a foot gun and it tends to be overused. Okay, so we're going to go over here to to-dos, and we'll kick this into here. Now, when we bounce into to-dos, you're going to see something else that's very interesting, probably haven't used before. Check out line 13. I'm using a new hook called use optimistic. Now, first we need to talk about what optimistic UI is, and the best way for me to show you this is by coming back over here to the application. So in this app, I can click add to add a new to-do. I'm running a mock API, and I have that mock API configured to be slow. And I'm deliberately making it slow because I want to show you why optimistic UI is useful. So when I say add here. I'm just going to put the word test and watch. I'm going to hit add and wait, done. Now you will notice at the bottom of the screen there was a little pending bar there. I'm going to get rid of this little tip here. And I'm putting this pending bar in here merely just so I can give you guys some kind of visualization that there is a background process going on, but I don't have to do anything. The other thing you will notice is when I add something, you're going to see it displayed in light gray. That's my way of conveying that it is added yet not saved yet. So what I want is for my application to feel fast, even if the back end is slow. That's why you do optimistic UI. So I'm going to say test 2. Now watch down here, because again, it's going to be in light gray. There it is, light gray. And then once it's actually truly saved, I make it look normal. Now that behavior, that visual that I'm showing there, doesn't have to exist. It's up to me. I could just immediately show this thing down here, not show the pending bar, and just quietly process it behind the scenes. It is my choice whether I want to style it differently while it is pending. Now that I've shown you optimistic UI, how many of you are implementing optimistic UI just in some way right now? Quite a few hands. Yeah, and it is really useful, but the problem with optimistic UI is the devil is in the details, because we are sort of lying to the user. We are saying, trust me, when you hit this button, we immediately did what you wanted. So then the question is, how much do we want to lie to them? Like I could fully lie to them and just immediately show this in black text, and they have no idea that it's not actually saved yet, that if that HTTP call maybe fails after 2 seconds, what should the user experience be? And this is one of the things that's really cool about this use optimistic hook. So let's look at it for a second. Normally, you would think I'd call use state right here, and I'd have some state for holding this thing that is going to be added, in this case a to-do. But instead, I'm calling use optimistic. And what I get back from it is an array of optimistic to-dos and also an action that I'm going to fire. And that action, just think about it as a function that does something. In this case, what it's going to do is add a to-do optimistically. So down here, this code is doing 2 things. It's accepting 2 arguments. First, it's what is the initial state, which I'm going to initialize it to whatever to-dos are passed in on props. Remember, where did these to-dos come from? We were just looking at the parent. The parent fetched that data from the database, and it's passing it in on props. And then the second argument here, this is a reducer. Most of us are probably familiar with reducers because use reducer supports it. But notice what it gives me is the current state and then the information about the new to-do that has just been added. So what I do is I return the new state down here. And I say, take all the existing state, and then this is a fake optimistic to-do. And that's part of why you'll notice I'm setting completed false, because that's the way an initial to-do is going to be. And then since I don't actually have a record saved from the database, there's this open question of what I do here on line 19. Now, yesterday when I was talking about this in my workshop, somebody made a good point. Anybody have a critique of what I'm doing on line 19? What is wrong with what I'm doing? And this is more of a TypeScript question than anything.
You're saving it as a string, but the database might be an integer.
Okay, so well, you're sort of on the right track. You said you're saving it as a string when the database might be an integer. That is a fair point. If I got the data type wrong, that would be a problem. Ideally, TypeScript is going to enforce this anyway. What the actual problem is that this is me lying to TypeScript. And if I were to say one of the most common mistakes that I see in TypeScript in general is React developers lying to TypeScript. And there are all sorts of examples of this. One simple example is, have you ever seen somebody say, as to do? That is sort of lying to TypeScript. We're saying, trust me, this is definitely a to-do TypeScript. Don't even go ahead and validate it. Just trust me that it's this way. That is called a type assertion. And when we tell TypeScript just to trust us, we don't get any help from TypeScript because it says, all right, well, I won't look at it then. Hopefully you're right. That's a dangerous thing to do. It's a slippery slope. Now here, I'm lying to TypeScript because I'm saying, yeah, this thing has an ID and here's its value, but that's not actually the value. In actuality, this new to-do doesn't have an ID because it hasn't actually been saved yet. So the mistake that I made is, if I had time, I would have refactored this last night, but after my old-fashioned, I decided no more coding. It was bedtime. So what actually needed to happen here was I need a type that allows me to convey an unsaved to-do. It's a different idea. So often in TypeScript, the mistake that we make is not thinking about the fact that we might have a distinction between an unsaved record and a saved record. And an unsaved record can never have an ID because the ID is assigned from the database, not from the front end. So I know this isn't about React 19, but I just want to emphasize this is a mistake I see all the time in TypeScript. Okay, so other things in here. We've got the title that's getting set to the new to-do that just came in. And then I set saving to true because initially it is saving, and that's precisely the information that I'm using to put this in gray for a little while it's processing. So this is use optimistic. Now, one of the cool things that you'll notice here is I didn't have to declare any state with use state. I declared it this way instead, and I set it up. And the other thing that's nice here is, what if it fails? And we actually have to have a conversation about this. Imagine that I come in here. I'm going to go ahead and delete. Oh, ignore the error. That's fine. It's demo code, right? I have a hydration issue, and I didn't have time to fix it, but it doesn't really affect our demo here. Okay, so I'm going to hit test for a second. Now imagine that after 2 seconds, the call actually failed. What should the user experience be at that point? Well, React actually has an opinion on this matter. You don't have to honor it, but use optimistic by default is going to do something for us, and I want to show you what it's going to do. We're going to go over here to my action. Now, we haven't really talked about actions yet. Actions are functions that live on the server that can be invoked from the client. And this is super powerful because you think about how often we end up creating endpoints so that we can basically post data to a function that lives on the server. So we end up creating REST APIs or GraphQL APIs or whatever. Well, now that React has manifestations on the server, if I want to expose a bunch of functions, and that's what we're looking at here is a bunch of functions. Let me open this just full screen. This file contains a bunch of functions like edit to do, add to do, toggle to do. All of these are accessible from the client even though they only live on the server. And the way that I do that is with one line of code. Line 1. It says use server, and this is a really confusing name. What I might call it, if I were to name it, would be expose the functions in this file over HTTP so that the client can call them. It's verbose, but it's clear. Everybody knows what that means. So use server, people keep looking at it and they think use server means it's a server component, right? No, no, no. What it means is expose this stuff so that the client can call it. Everything in here is accessible over HTTP now, just by putting the use server directive at the top. So it's really powerful. So we can come down here to the add to do. Here's the add to do function. And this is probably not going to surprise you too much. What does add to do? Well, it reads the form data to get the title, and it says if there isn't a title, I'm going to put a little validation in here and throw. Then we're going to go ahead and post to some endpoint. Now, given I could actually be literally hitting a database right here, because again, I'm sitting on the server. I went ahead and hit an API, but I could call Postgres or SQLite, whatever, right here. Now, what I'm going to do is break this. Now I'm going to have a bad URL. We're going to post Todd's instead. Todd isn't going to work, trust me. All right, so we're going to come back over here and watch what happens. I'm going to say test2 and click add and wait. See what happened? So after 2 seconds, it disappeared, which I think is a pretty good default. So what happens is use optimistic says, go ahead, add this thing in, but if it throws an error, I'm automatically going to revert the user interface back to the previous state for you, which I think that's pretty reasonable. Like really, because the data didn't save, that's probably the right decision. Now there is a separate decision. Maybe at this point, I probably should pop up a notification of some sort and say, hey, that thing actually didn't save, sorry about that. And this is also the risk of any optimistic UI is, what if somebody hits save, they see it down there, they think it worked and they close the browser before they even saw that it had failed. That's a risk of optimistic UI. That's the trade-off here. But use optimistic is really useful because we're now moving into a world where we're going to be calling things on the server, and who knows how fast or slow they might be, but we want to keep the front end nice and fast. So that's what use optimistic is doing for us, and we're calling these actions. Okay, so we come back over here, and I've got my to-dos. Now I want to point out, here's my add to-do form, and you'll notice that I'm passing it down that add optimistic to-do action. The term here is action. What I'm getting back from use optimistic is an action that is bound to this use optimistic hook. And this action that I am calling, we're going to go down here into the add to do form. So let's look at our form. Now, this is another place that we have new React 19 goodness. Check out line 13. Normally, if I was going to have a form, you might see me declaring some forms state with use state, but I'm not. I'm calling what's called use action state. And use action state returns a tuple of three things. I get the state, I get an action, and I get an is pending Boolean. So you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm passing it two things. I pass it the add to do action. This add to do action is that function that has been exposed over HTTP. Remember how I put use server at the top? So this add to do that I'm referencing right here, this is the function that I'm actually mentioning. We already looked at this one a moment ago. And this is exposed over HTTP because I have a use server here at the top. Now the reason that I call add to do and I get this action back to it is now this action is bound to the use action state hook. And what I do is I initialize that state to an empty state. And this is my empty form state. If we go look at what an empty form looks like, I've got some state right over here. It is just a add to do form state, which is this, a title error, set up like this. So there's really not much to it. But I can have a title error because if somebody enters an empty title, then it won't work. So if we go down here, you'll notice that normally, let me ask this. If you've got a form in React, how do you get that form to submit today? What attribute do you put on the form tag? On submit. Now, you said action, which is correct. That's what I'm doing here on line 23. And this is probably the weird thing to everybody in here, because I'm guessing most people in here have never used action before. This is new with React 19. So with action, I am able to say what action I want to perform when this form is submitted. And what action receives is the form data that was just posted. So you can see that I read this form data, and then I have some client-side validation here. I'm saying, if there's a title, then go ahead and add this optimistic to do, and then reset the form. Now, this is another interesting thing is, when I use the use action state hook, the form is actually automatically reset, but it's only reset after the form's processing is completed. So I'm just doing this earlier, because I want the form to reset the moment that I hit add. That just feels like a better user experience to me. So what I want to emphasize here is this action is new for 19, and it's getting called automatically when the form is submitted. So this is the new convention with 19. The other thing to notice is, what prop is missing on my input that you might have expected to see here?
Value.
Value. So is this a controlled input or uncontrolled? Uncontrolled. So an uncontrolled input means that React is not controlling its value, the browser is. And there's some benefits to doing that, namely performance. Because it means that every time that I type a keystroke, is it going to trigger a render? No, because React is not managing the rendering of this. The browser is instead. And that is pretty nice, because it also means I didn't have to put the value prop on here. I also didn't have to declare like backing store state for this. It just posts up. And the way that I read this is I read it by calling form data. One of the other nice things about this new paradigm with React 19 is that I'm using web standards. Like form data is the web's API. So now I'm using web's API. There are some downsides to it because you'll notice on line 24, it's not strongly typed. Everything that comes from form data is not going to be typed. It's just going to be something where I have to parse it and then figure out whether it's what I expect. So I hacked this in and just put as string, but ideally I would use Zod to validate it at runtime instead. Now, another cool thing that you get here, here's a little thing that I find interesting. What if I open up the DevTools? And inside the DevTools, I open up the Command tab and I disable JavaScript. JavaScript is not running anymore in my browser. Do you think that I can submit this? Who thinks I can still submit it? Oh, well, I kind of led you that way, so yeah. Nonetheless, you're supposed to be impressed. You're supposed to say, no way, Cory, it can't possibly be. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to say test 2. I'm going to hit add. So I just hit add, and nothing's happening. Nothing's happening. Well, sorry, what's that? Oh, that is true. So I actually still have it broken. Thank you. So let's go back over here. I should have fixed Todd here. When you said Todd, I was like, who's Todd? Is this a friend of yours? Does he want to pair program? We can hang out, yeah? Okay, so yeah, I fixed that now. All right, so we're going to come back over here. I am going to re-enable JavaScript for a moment here. We're going to come in here, reload, and I'm actually going to clear this out too. Ignore the error, don't worry about it. There's no man behind the wizard here. Yeah. All right, so disable JavaScript, here we go. And I'm going to pull this down so that we can see this come in. And say test, and hit add. So JavaScript is not working. We don't get any kind of feedback here because I'm doing optimistic adds on this whole thing. Now, if I hit refresh, it's also not going to work because I've just got a spinner here. But if I go in here, enable JavaScript, and I refresh, now it will load, and it didn't work. It made me a liar. It made me a liar. So I'm missing something at the moment. Maybe I'll come back to it when I figure out what it is. But the point that I want to make is that one of the benefits of this setup, yes?
You needed to do that form data.
I needed to what form data?
Form data. You had to create a new form data. I did it yesterday.
You're remembering the very thing that I fixed yesterday. Yeah, I believe you're right, but give me a second here. Sorry, what's that?
Can you pull out the title, like the conditional routing form? I imagine that would not be included, but that might be doing something to it, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to spend time debugging it. I'm going to ask you guys to trust me that here's, I do love pair programming with 70 people, but yeah, I may be rounding up. But so the thing that I was supposed to show here, but I broke my demo after drinking. But when you do this, if somebody clicks submit before JavaScript is available, it will submit, and it's going to fully post back to the server. So that's part of the benefit of having this new setup is you're leaning on plain old browser semantics that have worked from way back when in the late 90s, which is great. So imagine that somebody clicks submit like the moment things load, but before JavaScript is fully executed. Because remember, they're going to be able to see that markup right away. In that case, it's still going to post back. Now, you're not going to get the client-side validation because that's written in JavaScript. It's going to post right back to the server. And trust me, yesterday I did demo this and it did work, but then I tinkered during the workshop and I I thought I had undone my stuff, and I clearly didn't. So I'm sorry about that. But so I want to emphasize, this is one of the reasons that you'll probably want to move in this direction of using action is now you have graceful degradation, and you avoid that uncanny valley. Have you ever had this on a JavaScript app where you start clicking buttons and they don't work? And the reason they don't work is JavaScript hasn't parsed yet. So you might be on your cell phone and only some of the JavaScript has come down. So you click and nothing happens. Well, in React now, what will happen is it will post back instead. It kind of has a fallback mechanism there, which is really cool. Okay, so these are a few things to see, and I've shown you the fallback in here. I also want to just give you a sense of how much there is to talk about. And this is why, I've only got an hour in here to talk about it, but 2025, next year, something I'm focusing on is doing workshops at companies on React 19, like mastering React 19, because there's so much here. If you're interested in that, I'm actually going to share a little cheat sheet that I've created. It all fits on one page, but it also has my contact information. Reach out to me if you're interested in that, because I'd love to come to your company and do this. Now, what I want to emphasize is we've only talked about some of the new stuff. React 19 has 9 new features, 2 new directives, 5 new APIs, 3 new hooks. And when I wrote this slide, I just coincidentally, I thought it was kind of funny that it turns out it totals to 19. Just odd. So now, that's not totally fair, because if you actually go read the release notes, there are all sorts of changes in there where things that were deprecated literally in 2017, 2018, 2019 are finally getting removed today with React 19. So React has honored stability so well over the years that we're talking about things that have been deprecated for literally many, many years that are finally getting removed. So, yeah. I was trying to get Shaq to pop up earlier so he'd help me out, but yeah, all right. So 9 new features. We've covered some of these. React Server Components. We just saw React Server Components. These are components that render at build time or for each request, and this is a common point of confusion for people. At build time or for each request. Remember, you don't necessarily have to have this node server. You could create a static site and render it at build time using React Server Components. So 2 different ways to handle that. Actions, which we just saw. Actions are functions that use async transitions and automatically submit data for you. They support error handling, optimistic updates, and pending state. So we saw the optimistic updates. We saw the pending state that you get. And again, all we put is a little directive at the top of that file. What was that directive? Use server. Is it well named? No, but that's okay. All right. Actions. The next one is full custom element support. I will be frank, I'm not a fan of custom elements. 10 years ago, I thought they were cool. Now I just feel like they're not worth the squeeze at this point, but React at least finally has support for it, and I say, hey, might as well. That's nice. Document metadata support. As we saw, I put a little title tag in, and it just renders into the head. The other nice thing is this automatically hoists. You can have multiple, you can put them in lots of different components, and it's all going to end up in the head. Now we have style sheets with precedent settings, so I can import those style sheets in any one of my components, and I can say, this one's high priority, this one's medium priority, this one's low priority, so I can make sure that they end up in the right order in the head, and I can compose them in any component. Really cool stuff. This is a nice feature. I can render async scripts in any component, and they're automatically deduped. I can preload resources via prefetch DNS, preconnect, preload, also nice. And then this is another one that's going to help solve all sorts of errors, which is unexpected tags in the head and body are skipped. For those that have been using Next.js for the last few months, you've probably felt many annoyances where it says, oh, hydration error, it doesn't match what I had on the server with the client, and then it wouldn't tell you why or where. You would just go, huh. Well, thanks. I made a mistake somewhere in my code base. I'll begin reading every line now. Not good. Now, recently they've improved error messaging here, but this is going to help avoid showing an error at all, which is good news. Another thing is better error reporting. It's going to automatically remove duplicate errors. If you've seen some stack traces, you could end up seeing the same error many times in there. So now they're deduping that. This will also help the developer experience. So those are the 9 new features. We have 2 new directives, and we've looked at only one of them. Use, and this is the one we haven't looked at, use client. mark code that only runs on the client. So this is how you declare a client component. So let's just look over here, use client. I have lots of components here that use client. Here's my error component. Let's look at one that's a little more interesting. Here we go. Here's my page for my contact form. Notice that on line 1 I say use client, and the reason that I do that is I have to put use client at the top because you can only use hooks in client components. That's a very important distinction. So if I took this out and I try to render this page, it will fail because line 9 is calling a hook. And in fact, I can prove it. Let's come over here for a second. And we're going to click on contact. So there's a contact page. Well, what if I try to make this a server component? In Next.js, by default, if you don't declare a directive at the top, it is considered a server component. So it's going to try to render this on the server. Now it's going to say, hey, you're importing a component that needs use action state. This hook only works with a client component. To fix it, put use client at the top. Really nice error message. This is helpful. This is great. So I have to make this a client component. Now the other thing that's cool here is with a client component, remember, this is going to be the traditional React model. JavaScript's going to get sent down. It's going to be parsed. It's going to render this component. Now, if I, on the other hand, have a server component, what if I do this? What if I go over here to the date page? Now, this is a very simple page. And notice I have no directive at the top. So is this a server component or a client component? Server component. Now, that's also a bit of a gray line because this is technically, this could be either. Can anybody explain how this could be a server component or a client component?
Depends where it's
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, he beat you to the punch. But yes, it depends who renders it. If this is rendered by a client component, then it will be a client component. Because once you have a client component, any of its children are going to be client components. So you can think of it as a door that opens up, some people say, or you can think, wait, you're doing this. Was that not fair?
Technically, you could pass in a children props like a Y component to pass a server.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So the point that you're making is you can use the slot pattern so that you can compose server components within client components. So you could have slots or children, whatever you want to call them. When I say slots, I mean named props that will render a component. So for instance, I could have this date component and it could accept a children of some sort, and then I could render those children here. And that child, this could be a server component that I'm passing in on props from some parent. And that would be valid. So then I've got this weird situation where the client component is kind of rendering a server component. So that's an interesting edge case, and it's actually quite useful as well. Okay, we've got like 13 minutes. What I want to emphasize with this page, though, over here on date. So I am showing a date, and I'm formatting that date using a library called day.js. And day.js, it's a date library, so it weighs a few K. But what's really cool is this is rendering on the server, so day.js is not being sent to the client. This page, the only weight of this page is the text that you're seeing here. The library that generated this stays on the server. So this is super cool. Think about how many times you've got this big, heavy dependency that you'd really rather not have on the client. You go, well, can we do that processing on the server and then just send down the result? So this is a new world with React Server components. I can keep big, heavy, bloated libraries on the server only and make my front end faster. Every time that I create a server component, I've avoided a set of JavaScript that otherwise would have been sent down. So this is quite powerful. Really like this pattern. Okay, so back over here, I just showed the use client directive. We talked about the use server directive, which marks server-side functions that can be called from the client. Okay, we got 5 new APIs. Use is interesting because it lets me use promises or context in render. Now, this is also where I feel like they cheated a bit. Use is not a hook, despite the fact that it starts with the word use and ends with the word use. They are calling it an API, not a hook. And the reason that they're doing that is it breaks the rules of hooks. It can be called conditionally. And this is going to be one of those things that every other framework is going to be saying, yep, another example of a bad decision by React, like ugly and all this. I'm like, well, I don't know. I do find it confusing, frankly, that I have to call this an API, but that's what it is. So use, let's just show an example of calling use right here. Here I am consuming a context. Normally, when you'd consume a context, you'd use context.consumer, or maybe you'd create a custom hook to wrap that context. Now I can just pass that context to the use API. Notice how I didn't say hook. Don't do it, because it's not one. And because this is not a hook, I could even validly say if whatever, I don't know. I could wrap this in theory, and then notice that this is not a compile time error. Now it's just merely pointing out I'm not doing anything with this value, but I could wrap it in a conditional, and it is valid to do so, because it is just an API. It's not a hook. I don't have to follow the rules of hooks. The other way that you can use is over here. I could use it on a promise. So here I am getting a promise passed in on props, and I can read that promise and wait for it. Now here I'm not waiting for it. I'm just taking the response, using it, and then down here below I parse it. So I don't have to put an await in here. I just say use this promise, and once that promise is available, it's going to move on. So that's the power of the use API. And I'm still toying with it. It's an interesting idea, and the fact that you can call it conditionally is also interesting, so I'm toying with exactly what practical things come up here.
Do you have no way to use?
I don't believe so. You do not, and you can see that you don't have to because I'm using it right here. Here I'm using, this is what I wanted to show you is, notice that I'm not awaiting this in comments, and the user experience is interesting here because if I come over here to the blog, here's the experience. Notice how it says, I'm going to reload this so you can see it again. Loading seems nice. So what we got here was we got all this, and then we got a loading indicator until the comments were loaded. And we got that because what happens is on this line, it's implicitly awaiting right here. Now, if I put in await right here, and I made this an async function right here, well, now notice that use cannot be called within an async function. It's expected to be a sync function, so yeah, not going to work. Do it this way instead. Okay, so we're going back over here. Got a couple more things. Streamline context, we saw this. I can just, oh, actually I didn't show that. You can use context instead of context provider. So I have a context in here, my user context provider, and it is, notice that I don't say, right here, notice that I don't say user context.provider on line 23. Now you can just say user context and pass it a value. So the context API has gotten streamlined. It's a nice little touch. Use deferred value now accepts an initial value too. I'll breeze past that one. This is probably one that you haven't used much. Who in here has used use deferred value? It already exists, but frankly, I don't find it useful often. It's there if you really need it. Okay, and then 3 new hooks. We looked at all 3 of these. Use action state for declaring form state. Oh, we didn't look at use form status, just really quickly. Use form status, another new hook. Use form status allows me to read the form status, and the place that you're probably going to use this most is you'll go create your own submit button, and then you will read the form status using a hook. What happens is as long as I render this button underneath a form, then I can magically read whether that form is pending and then change my button styling based on that. I could disable it, I could put in a message, whatever. The important thing here is this has to be a separate component. So if we look at where submit button is actually rendered, you will notice that submit button is rendered right here inside the form. But I have to put it in a separate component so that I can read that form status. So that's the one kind of downside is I can't put this submit button in line. I have to declare it separately, but then I can read the status. But it's pretty nice because now I've got this reusable button component and I don't even have to have state for it. It just is reading the form status. Really nice touch. And it emphasizes that point I was making of paving the cow path. Like lots of people need to do it. Let's make it easier for them. Okay, I also want to draw some clarity here that there are some things that were released but you might have overlooked. Use transition, start transition. I should have put use deferred as well. These are already here, but lots of people aren't using them, so I'd suggest looking into those. You can update state without blocking UI. This is going to become more common in React 19 that you're using these. Released but not part of React is server only, which is a way to mark code that can only be used on the server so that there's no way to get it back, get it down on the client. And then the React compiler is coming soon, but not part of React. React compiler is going to make React faster. I just tweeted this out yesterday. Somebody had changed over to use React compiler on their application. They had a page that was taking 1.7 seconds just to redraw. And then when they scrolled, it was super janky and jumpy. They put compiler on, and all of a sudden it took 0.1 seconds to redraw, and the scroll was just smooth. Like fantastic. Just throw the compiler at it, and things get faster. So a whole set of people are going to get a lot of value out of the compiler. This is in beta, but you can use it now, and you don't have to move to 19. It works on 17, it works on 18. So I really encourage you, go put this on your app now. Like, even in beta, it works well. Then these last two, cache and taint. Yes, that's what they called it. Let's be adults. Yeah. These are coming soon, but they are not part of 19, but this will give us caching, and this will let us prevent an object from being passed to a client component. Yeah?
Sorry, when you say not part of 19, does that mean it'll be 19 point something, or it's 20?
I don't know. Presumably it'll be 19.1 because these will be add-ons, not breaking changes. So I suspect fast follow for the 19 release is where it will be. Okay, we got like 4 minutes, and this is sad because I did have this whole Jeopardy routine where I have all these problem solution things. Like, you can do this on your own where you go through and you say, here's a problem, how would I solve it with React 19? So you can kind of quiz yourself with flashcards. This is what I do in the actual workshop if you guys set this up. And on that front, let me show this for a second. This is the React 19 cheat sheet on the right. This is everything you need to know at a very high level about React 19. It fits on one sheet. You can print it off. Also at the top, I talk about the Mastering React workshop that I'm doing next year. So if your company's interested, you can contact me. Cory at React.js Consulting is my email. Scan this. This will get you the cheat sheet. The other thing that I want to share with you is the demos that I have and the slides that I have are sitting on GitHub. If you go out to my GitHub, it's github.com/CoryHouse. It's pretty easy to find my GitHub. Just Google for me, and you'll find it. But the repo is called Next React 19. So pretty obvious there. I'm just letting people get pictures before we close here. All right, we're going to have to skip Jeopardy, although, man, this was going to be fun, y'all. Maybe we could do this out in the after lunch or something. I'm going to bounce down here to the bottom as well. Lots of other good stuff in here. Like, there are 30 different ways to handle React State. I'd love to have talked about this. There's a flow chart for choosing these, which is interesting. The repo is called Next React 19. Go out to my GitHub repo to find it. The demos and the slides are there for you. Last thing is, I am on X or Twitter under HouseCore. I tweet about once a day about software. I author courses on Pluralsight. I have a bunch of React courses, other front-end courses. So you can check me out there. They have a free trial that you can do as well. I feed my family through reactjsconsulting.com. This is me. I'm independent. For better or worse, if you work with me, this is who you get. So I am independent there. Been doing that for years. I'd love to help your team. I'm also doing code audits in 2025. So if you want to find out, email me. I'll do a free code audit for your team. We'll spend a few minutes, look it over. It's a good way to get to know each other, and then you can figure out whether it might be a good fit for a longer-term engagement of some sort. What do you guys think? Are you excited about 19? Does this look cool? Good. Thank you for coming.